Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session, which is entitled The Crisis in US Global Leadership. So all of us have been poring over the results from the midterm elections and the aftermath, which has been colourful, as usual. As I've been saying to Nick, there is this real confusion in the UK about the blue tide and the red tide, and how it is that the right wing in America are bright red and the left wing are blue. So the colour of the revolution maybe appropriately on the Republican side. So anyway, we couldn't have a better person to guide us through the jungle that is American politics and the role of America in the world today than Nick Burns, who is the Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at Harvard University. Kennedy School at Harvard University. A grand title he has, along with about a dozen other titles as well. But as some of you will know, he spent 27 years in the service of the United States government, latterly as Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, the number 3 position in the State Department, and of course as US Ambassador to NATO, and before that to Greece. He's on a number of boards, both in the public and private sector, and like me, he is a senior counsellor with the Washington-based Cohen Group, led by former Secretary of Defense William Cohen. He writes for the Boston Globe and Global Post, and he's vice chairman of the American Ditchley Foundation. But he is a good friend of mine and was an enormous support to me in my years as the NATO Secretary General, not least during that period after 9/11, when the alliance invoked Article 5, the mutual defence, a provision of the North Atlantic Treaty as well. A moment of high drama and political consequence as well. So he's a friend and also one of the most distinguished commentators now on American affairs, both domestic and foreign. So, Nick, tell us what's happening, please.
Well, thank you, Lord Robertson. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon in London. I just arrived this morning from the States, from the frenzy over the midterm elections. We can talk about that. I did want to say a word about George. He's a great friend. We are still working together 18 years later. On 9/11, we spoke in the mid and then late afternoon and the evening. It was a remarkable day because when the NATO treaty was signed, April 4th, 1949, Article 5 was written in to guarantee that the U.S. and Canada would come across the pond a third time if necessary in the 20th century. And one of the great ironies is the only time we've ever invoked it was for the Europeans and Canadians to come to the assistance of the United States. It was a remarkable day. We were worried, because we operate by consensus at NATO, that if we put it up for discussion, if one or two of the countries, and I suspected Greece, I had just come from Greece 2 weeks before, and I thought maybe they'd object, but they didn't. And every country agreed to go in with us, and what is even more remarkable, that every country went into Afghanistan, and they're still there. Every NATO ally is still in one form or another in the Afghan mission 17 years later. We were together then. We went to the Pentagon 10 days after 9/11 together, George and I, and stood looking up at that part of the Pentagon where one of the flights had hit, where a lot of people had died. And we were together in August 2003 when we deployed 8,000 troops into Afghanistan, NATO troops. So a lot of history between us. I'm a great admirer of Lord Robertson. If you haven't read his Guardian article today on why the United Kingdom and France ought to be accelerating their military cooperation at a time of uncertainty, it's a really fine piece of work that King's College and the Montaigne Institute have done together to talk about this critical link between two of the Security Council members, nuclear powers, frenemies historically, but certainly since 1904, allies, France and the UK. So thank you, George. What I propose to do is have a discussion George has asked me to say a few words. Why don't I talk about Trump a little bit? What impact has he had on American foreign policy? You all have your own opinions on this. I'll give you mine. And then maybe just a few words of instant analysis of what do these midterm elections mean for both the U.S. and for those countries that have a close relationship with the U.S. Then let's have a conversation. I would start by saying this. I think we may be at the most significant point of divide I'm not just seeing friends here as I look through this audience, in the transatlantic relationship in many decades. I think the crisis we're experiencing now across the Atlantic, I think, is more severe than Iraq 2003 or the Euro missile crisis of 1983, 84, 85, or Suez 1956. Those were profound disagreements on single issues. But we have a division of values now, getting to the root of what a democratic society is and how it should behave in the world. I think that's what the crisis is about right now. So in many ways, this is a more serious, deeper crisis than we've experienced in many, many decades, perhaps even in the lives of most people, all of us in this room. Where are the divisions? We're divided on climate, where the Trump administration has taken us out of the Paris Agreement. We're divided on the Iran nuclear deal. I spent 3 years negotiating with John Soros, representing the UK, and France, and Germany, and China, and Russia, as we set up the P5+1, as we started to sanction Iran and then thought about negotiating with Iran. And I was a great supporter of President Obama and what he did with all those countries, the P5+1, in putting Iran into a nuclear straitjacket. Mistake to leave, I think, for the United States. That's divided us from Britain, France, Germany, China, Russia, and many others in the international system. But then to compound the problem this past Monday, to announce and implement the secondary sanctions, where after these reprieves have been given to 9 countries 6 months from now, a British firm, a French firm, a German firm, a Russian firm, Chinese seeking to do business with Iran would have to choose between the Iranian market and the American market. It's a big weapon. I'm just not sure how smart it is for the United States to divide ourselves from our allies, compounding the problem of leaving the agreement. And then, of course, we have trade differences. I hope this trade war between the U.S. and EU has subsided, but I'm not completely sure. After the meeting with Juncker and Trump in July, they called a truce. I'm not sure that they've been able to go beyond the truce. The divisions, of course, have been authored by a unique American president. He is ambivalent at best about NATO, and I'm being a very generous grader as a university professor to call him ambivalent at best when he refused to recognize America's commitment to Article 5 in his first visit to NATO, when he refused again at Helsinki to back up Montenegro, and whether or not the United States would support Montenegro in the event of a Russian interference in their affairs. He is absolutely not ambivalent about the European Union. The European Union is a strategic competitor to the United States. It is a foe. No other American president going back to Truman, either Republican or Democrat, has ever thought of the European Union as a strategic competitor and a foe, much less NATO. He is the weakest president we've had on Russia, at a time when Russia has assaulted, and that's the right word to use, not interfered or meddled with, our electoral process and those of many of the European allies. When the Russians in Georgia 2008, Crimea 2014, eastern Ukraine today have fundamentally violated international law in their conquest territorial to the south and west of the Russian Federation, Trump's been a protector of Putin, has never once criticized him. A protector of Putin. Trump, disinterested in helping Europe cope with the structural problems confronting the EU, both economic and political. Not interested at all in helping on issues that George and I spent a lot of time on in the 1990s, as well as the first decade of this century, the weakening of the Bosnian state, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the problems between Serbia and Kosovo, the fact that the Balkans are very important for the stability of Europe. The United States always wanted to help Europe, and now we're completely AWOL, George, from that struggle. That's another problem with Trump's foreign policy. And I think in many respects Trump has overturned the fundamental pillars of American strategy since 1945. That all of our presidents, Republican and Democrat, have believed are important. We believe really four things about the world. One is that our alliances are sacred, vital to our future. George and I were just talking about this. And the alliances are our power differential. NATO between the West and Russia, our 6 East Asian allies, the power difference between the United States and China, vital for American security. The president seems entirely disinterested in these alliances in Western Europe and in East Asia. Number one, he's overturned that pillar of our foreign policy. Number two, he's dismantled American participation in the global multilateral trade system, preferring the competition that comes with bilateral trades and the uncertainty, and gave up the great strategic promise that we could hold China to account in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, 40% of global GDP. And think about, this was going to be difficult, a EU-US free trade agreement, the 2 largest economic blocs in the world, all democracies, would have been a very powerful voice for evening out trade in the world, for holding to account countries that are trade pirates and trade violators and IP violators. We've given up that strategic opportunity in Asia and Europe. And of course in our own hemisphere, we have a symbiotic economy, really. Uniting Mexico, Canada, and the United States, we're building walls to the south and calling Justin Trudeau public enemy number 1. I've never thought of Canadians as particularly offensive. The United States is so fortunate in our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, and yet Trump is deepening the divisions. It's a second basic pillar. A third, of course, is immigration and refugees. We're an immigrant nation. We're a refugee nation. Every family in the country has an immigrant or a refugee story. We've been taking in about 100,000 immigrants a year, about 70,000 refugees a year. We'll only take in about 19,000 refugees this year. We're not helping the EU cope with the greatest refugee crisis since 1945. 65 million refugees and displaced persons in the world today, the greatest number since 1945. The United States not participating in a meaningful way in helping the rest of the world cope with that. And finally, the fourth pillar is the most important. It's the democratic bond. It's the belief in human rights. It's the belief in democracy and human freedom. And at a time when that's under assault in the continent, the United States siding with Viktor Orban, the Polish government, Salvini, and openly deriding Angela Merkel and Theresa May, and trying to sink them politically. I can come to no other understanding of what Trump did here in London when he praised Boris Johnson as he was meeting with the Prime Minister. And no other alternative to understand the repeated attacks on Merkel and Germany and the repeated praise for Orban and the Polish government. He has turned American foreign policy in its most critical aspects upside down, and repudiated, if you want to talk in Trumpian terms, what made us great were these 4 pillars. And these 4 pillars are about integration with our allies. So that's the case, that Trump is the most disruptive and I think disturbing president we've had. And we've got to, I think, come back to first principles in the United States. Where might Trump be right? 2 thoughts for you. He's right about NATO defense spending, as was Bob Gates, as was Don Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry. Britain is above 2% of GDP. France is above 2% of GDP, but Germany's at 1.2 or 3. And Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain, not much better. And Canada, barely at 1%. And what I find in the U.S. is that where Trump has really made an impact as a fundamental issue of fairness is on this issue that we're at 3.7%. And it's fundamentally unfair for some of these big West European countries not to be meeting their responsibilities. And I would hope that Europeans would reflect on that. I think the trend lines are positive heading towards 2024. That nearly all the allies will be at 2% by 2024. A more meaningful metric, every ally will spend at least 20% of their military budget on military R&D or the acquisition of new hard technologies. That's a more meaningful metric. So the trend lines since 2014, Putin, Crimea, have been positive, but Trump's acting, he's not acknowledging that, but there's a kernel of truth here that I think Europeans should reflect on. The second area where I think Americans worry is we hope that you'll be patient with us. I still see, even after the midterms, Trump as a fundamental aberration in American politics. I don't believe his Republican or Democratic successor in 2020 or 2024 will act anything like him, because the polls show, and if you survey the senior Republicans, they believe in NATO. Most of them believe in free trade. All of them want to support democracies in the world. And so I do think he's an aberration. But for Europeans to be talking about strategic autonomy, that's coming out of France. It's coming out of Paris. First of all, let's be honest, there is no capacity to be strategically autonomous. A better way to phrase it might be strategic responsibility. George's article this morning, Lord Robertson's article in The Guardian, his commission with the French, talking about the UK-French access, or if you want to talk about PESCO, these are not threats to NATO. As long as they don't duplicate or interfere with what NATO is doing, they'll support NATO. But to talk about strategic autonomy cuts out the Americans and implicitly the Canadians, and after 70-odd years of alliance, rather presumptuous. Where are the challenges, if you look at Trump, what he's done, where are the challenges for us going forward? First, in Afghanistan, remarkable turnabout in Washington. Mike Pompeo, Jim Mattis, both saying in orchestrated statements 2 weeks ago, we need to end the Afghan war. Zalmi Khalilzad, appointed, very skilled American diplomat, appointed our envoy to the talks, opening up talks with the Taliban. I think this is strategically and tactically smart. 17 years, major Western commitment, 1,000 European and partner deaths, 2,500 American deaths, billions of dollars, at one point over 100,000 NATO troops in the country, still now a substantial military force. No end in sight to the fighting. There has to be a political diplomatic frame here. There has to be some effort towards a ceasefire and some kind of understanding between the Ashraf Ghani government and the Taliban. That's ahead of us. What else is ahead of us is the U.S.-China relationship. This is going to be the defining issue for the United States for the next 50 years. Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, has made two very significant speeches, September and October, in the United States this autumn. In both speeches essentially saying, for 40 years since Deng Xiaoping, the West, Japan, and South Korea have been engaging China. And Kevin says now, there's no question we have swung from strategic engagement to strategic competition. And it's really striking to see this in the United States. It's not just Vice President Pence's unbelievably tough speech, which didn't get enough press exposure because he made it the day that the Kavanaugh crisis crested in our politics at home. But this is a speech that essentially opened up the aperture of a competitive future, economically, trade, South China Sea, East China Sea, the military balance. We have believed for 40 years that we are competitors with China, but we're also partners with China. And now both political parties in the United States, because the Democrats have joined this, are entirely in the competitive school. I worry about that when we have to work with China on stabilizing the global economy, China on climate change. There are all sorts of issues where the Chinese have capacity. We're going to compete with them, and that's important. But there has to be some kind of balance, and our political system, George, is entirely in the competitive field. So that's something to think about. For Europeans, for Brits, where are you in this relationship? And how should we be thinking together about a European North American strategy coping with a very aggressive, assertive China in the Western Pacific, trying to push the American carrier battle groups off to the second island chain, trying to seek a dominant military role. I think that's Xi Jinping's strategy if you read his speech, October 2017, to the 19th Party Congress. Finally, where else are we going? The battle of technology is ahead of us. What do I mean by that? The biggest military issue we have is will we retain in NATO, in our East Asian alliance, a technologically superior military position that we've enjoyed since the Second World War. But the tech battles for the future militarization of artificial intelligence and robotics and quantum computing and in biotech, we're going to have a technological race with the Chinese to see which country, which bloc, if you will, the West or China, will achieve the new generation of weaponry that's bound to come in the next 10 to 20 years out of our scientific and university research labs. And right now the Chinese have the ability to reach into any Chinese company and assure that that technology is ready for the PLA. That's not true of Britain, it's not true of Western Europe, it's not true of the United States. Our tech companies are not tied to the government. But put it in stark military terms, carrier battle groups and F-35 fighters could be obsolete within 2 decades. We might be looking at something, we're just on the eve of the centennial of the end of the Great War. That Great War introduced entirely new military technologies, aircraft, tanks. We may be entering a period of history of that kind of rapid, complete technological modernization. And if we lose the technology race, then China could become a more dominant military power than Japan or South Korea or NATO countries or Canada or the United States. We can't let that happen. This issue is at the heart of what's happening at the State Department, the Pentagon, and every university research lab in the United States, and the same is true of China. That's the battle of technology. Battle of ideas, that's Putin and Xi Jinping and Erdogan and MBS essentially saying that their authoritarian political structure is the way forward. And we don't really have a Margaret Thatcher or a Helmut Kohl or a Francois Mitterrand or a Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush to stand up and compete about the Western democratic model. The Prime Minister here is tied down by Brexit. The Chancellor in Germany is tied down by a weakening of her party and of her own position in German politics. And President Trump is entirely disinterested in waging a battle of ideas where he stands on the Democratic side. That worries me greatly. Which leads me to the last point, the midterms. What do they mean? And how might they affect the politics of the United States? Just a few thoughts based on conversations that I've had with members of Congress, and journalists, and people I trust in Washington. I think the headline is, it's from the Bible, it's from Matthew, the New Testament, but it's also from Abraham Lincoln, 1858, as he sought to run for the Senate, an election he would lose, that freed him up to run for president 2 years later. A house divided against itself cannot stand. A house divided. We are a house divided in the United States. We're divided on multiple levels. Red, blue. North, south. Left, right. Liberal, conservative. Female, male, if you look at the voting patterns in both parties. Women are the dominant force, voting and now running in the Democratic Party. And white males over 50, non-university graduates, are the center of power in the Republican Party. We are a house divided. House of Representatives will be controlled by the Democrats as of January 2019. The Senate controlled by the Republicans. Was this an electoral victory for Donald Trump? Was he right to say that in his bizarre press conference yesterday? And the answer is maybe. They broadened their numerical support in the Senate. They prevented the midterms from being a defeat for Trumpism and Trump's ideology. The massive blue wave never materialized. So that's the Trump case. I think the Democratic case is actually stronger. I'm a little bit subjective because I'm a member of that party, and I supported Hillary Clinton in her campaign in 2016. They took back control of the House. Think of it this way. For the last 6 years, the Republicans have dominated Washington. And for the last 2 years, they've controlled every branch of the three-tiered American government. The House of Representatives is an extremely powerful institution. The Democrats will now have both blocking power of Trump initiatives and investigatory power of Trump excesses. And they will use that aggressively in this bitter fight for power, heading towards the mother of all elections in 2020. Here's some other data points. The Democrats will probably end up, because there are 3 or 4 seats still being counted, have yet to be determined in Georgia, in Texas, in California. They'll likely have close to a 40-seat pickup. In the next week or two, we'll know the final figures. That is historically the 6th most impressive performance by an opposition party since 1945, or the 6th worst for the incumbent president. They flipped 7 governorships, meaning 7 Republican governors succeeded now by 7 Democratic governors. In the upper Midwest, where Trump won the election in 2016, in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the heartland of the industrial Midwest, there were 7 key elections for governor and Senate. The Democrats won, there were 8 key elections, the Democrats won 7 of those elections. The Democrats picked up 330 seats in key state legislatures. We now will have over 100 women in the House of Representatives, nearly 1/4 of the members. That is a historically high number. And I think the big impact of this election is the rise of women in the Democratic Party. Female candidates who had never been in politics, female veterans of our military who won elective office. They are millennial. They're going to change our politics. It's a big voting bloc for the Democrats. So I would say the Democrats have the advantage of the midterms. But what's ahead of us? Trump fired his Attorney General. He did not appoint the Deputy Attorney General to be acting, which is quite unusual. He appointed the Chief of Staff, who's a Trump loyalist, to be acting Attorney General. Everyone expects Robert Mueller to be to make known whether or not there'll be indictments of Trump associates or Trump himself. If the president tries to interfere with that process, we'll have a constitutional crisis, and we'll have a Democratic majority in the House with impeachment powers as of January 2021. As Ed Luce said in the FT this morning, you ain't seen nothing yet. He thinks, in a brilliant column this morning in the FT, we've just gone through a mercurial 2 years. It might be even more mercurial and more unstable in the 2 years to come. Thank you, sir. That's my report.
Well, that's cheered us all up. So, but nobody came here to be cheered up, exactly. I suppose. But I think you've given us quite a clarification of what's going on. But the future is cloudy and unpredictable and probably unstable as it stands at the moment. I'd use the chair, but by the way, the remarks are on the record that were made, and the Q&A is off the record. That's the standard IISS way of doing it. So I'll abuse the chairmanship and ask a question. There's another war going on at the present moment where the United States and the UK are involved, and that is in Yemen. And there have now been statements made by a number of the parties saying it's got to be brought to a conclusion. Well, what's your view on that?
I think we're looking at a big turnaround in the Trump administration's thinking. First, whereas President Trump has not ever really condemned the Saudi leadership for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but he was a permanent resident of the United States. And therefore we have, I think, a legal as well as moral obligation to seek a measure of justice. That issue has now been connected with the Yemen issue in American politics. I think you're close to a majority of the Senate in both parties that would respond well to a clear repudiation of the Saudi regime and of Mohammed bin Salman specifically for the murder of Khashoggi and for some type of punitive action. That leads us to Yemen. Greatest, most horrific outbreak of cholera in modern times. The United Nations now thinks, as of this morning, 10 million Yemenis at risk of famine, at least 15,000 civilians dead, and a lot of it committed by American and British weapons of war, used by the Emiratis and the Saudis. Both Mike Pompeo and Jim Mattis, mirroring their public statements on Afghanistan, now talking about ending the war in Yemen. I think we could see either an administration effort or a congressional effort to cut off American arms sales to the Saudis and Emiratis. It would be the right thing to do. This is a horrific war. They have miscalculated. They've overstepped. There was a heart-rending photograph of a young 7-year-old girl on the cover of the New York Times a week ago Sunday. She has since died. She starved to death. And this has really affected our public debate. It's become a prominent issue. I think we're at a big turning point away from supporting the Saudis and Emiratis, and that's the right thing to do.
Right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Charles, yeah. Could I ask you, you alluded to the fact that there's a divide between the Republicans and the Democrats, obviously. But it would seem there is actually quite a lot of support for some of Trump's policies in relation to China and to the JCPOA and others. Do you think that these will continue after 2020 and that actually the culture and ethos of the American political system has actually signed up to a considerable, or certainly a certain extent, to the Trump attitudes, both within America and also in foreign policy?
It's a really fine question, and thank you for asking it. It's a complex question. I'd answer it just 2 points. First point, if you look at the major opinion polls in the United States that measure our public attitudes, and the most recent, very good one is the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations that our mutual friend Ivo Daalder heads. They show on alliances, particularly NATO, on trade, on immigration, on the importance of the EU, major American public support in both parties for Europe, for the EU, particularly for NATO, historically high levels of support, I think because Trump has been so openly critical, and even for immigration and for trade, and the Democratic Party we're now beginning to see over the last couple of years, majority support of Democrats polled for free trade, which we had never seen before. Democrats have been the opponent of most free trade agreements. I do see President Trump as out of step with the American people as they're polled, and with most senior Republicans on most of those issues. I testified before the Foreign Relations Committee 2 months ago, Republican chaired, on the issue of NATO and Russia, sanctioning Russia, blocking Putin, and only one senator openly disagreed with my contention that Trump's too weak and that we have to be working more with NATO against Russia. And that was Rand Paul, who's a famous or infamous isolationist. But most of the other senior Republicans, quite critical of the president. Where are they with him? They're with him on domestic issues. They're with him on taxation, deregulation, the domestic agenda, guns, that kind of thing, but not with him on foreign policy. And I think Democrats and Republicans tend to agree more on foreign and defense policy than certainly not on domestic policy. Point two, where is their support for Trump? There is not significant support in the Democratic Party for leaving the Iran nuclear deal. There are some Democrats who thought that was right, but most didn't. There is almost universal support for a containment of Iran's conventional power in the Gulf, in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, in both parties. And second, the new Trump get tough policy in China has a lot of Republican Party support and a lot of Democratic Party support. And this is what's so interesting, to see the two parties swinging towards competition versus a strategic engagement of the last 4 decades. It's a major change in American policy. And those Kevin Rudd speeches, the first is at San Mateo College in September, the second is at the U.S. Naval Academy in October. Well, I've just read both of them, assigned them to my students. I think Kevin is one of the most astute observers of both China and the United States. He's very worried that we don't have the correct balance here, and I think he's right.
Anybody else? Yeah, you go first. As
Louis Reitman, I'm a postgrad at the LSE, and this week there was a really good article in The Economist laying out the prospect that with Beto O'Rourke losing to Beautiful Ted, as the president has dubbed him now, there's a more centrist Democratic candidate for 2020 is more likely. If we're going to see a more centrist Democratic administration in 2020, hypothetically, what can we expect foreign policy-wise?
It's very good. Thank you for that question. By the way, I think we have veterans of The Economist here. I think The Economist is still the number one source for analysis and news in the English-speaking world. I tell my students, you have to read it every week, cover to cover. So thank you for reading.
No time for doing anything else then.
What a phenomenon this guy, Congressman Beto O'Rourke, was. 49% of the vote in red Texas. And there was a point at about 9:15 Tuesday night when it looked like he might even win. He ran a brilliant race. What can we conclude from it? That a person can be true to his or her own values. He's a real progressive. And actually contest in the battle of ideas inside our democratic society. That in Texas we saw real breakthroughs in that red state. Now pockets of blue in the State House and in Congress. Some senior Texans lost their races to Democrats. In Texas they elect judges, and there was almost a complete sweeping out of Republican judges to replace by Democratic judges. The similar trends in Georgia and in other parts of the American South and West. Oklahoma had a Democrat elected as unheard of. Kansas, Republican gubernatorial candidate defeated by a Democrat. So the big blue-red maps you've probably seen on television are becoming more complex in the Democratic inroads. And a lot of that due to massive disappointment and delusion because of the reign of Donald Trump. So I think that's something to think about. In 2020, there are about 30 Democrats, by my count, who are considering running for the presidency. And you're going to start to see some of them declare themselves in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 60 days to raise the money necessary to run a national campaign. And the conventional wisdom before the midterms was that the energy in the Democratic Party was in the progressive left wing, the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren wing. But actually the Democrats who did best, and Beto is an exception, on Tuesday were middle-of-the-road Democrats trying to reach independents and disaffected Republicans. And I would think that's, from that group of people will come the presidential nominee, a centrist Democrat. That's my prediction. I could be wrong. That's where I think the lesson of the midterms is. That it's not enough to win over the People's Republic of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I live, or the People's Republic of Berkeley, California, that you have to reach in out to the suburbs where a lot of people live, and to the exurbs out 20, 30 miles beyond the core of our major cities. That's where most voters are. And they tend to be centrists, and they swing between the two parties, and you've got to capture that vote. And most of the Democrats captured those votes. The 7 who won in the upper Midwest, centrists.
How about the People's Republic of China?
Hi, Ambassador. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
I used to work in Washington, D.C., and I remember that you were engaged in the strategic dialogue with China at that time. And also, during the time of Hillary Clinton, she also said that China and the United States are like two people crossing the river in the same boat and should help each other. So how would you explain the change of attitude from engagement to more competition, and do you think that's enjoying cross-sector support, and especially like the latest trade war?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the question. I'll just be very blunt, but I hope in a very respectful way, say that I think that the constituency that supported engagement with China, in the U.S. at least, has really disappeared. It was our business community. It was centrist politicians. It was foreign policy diplomats. But as we've seen China essentially violate the intellectual property of American tech companies who engage in joint ventures in China, and we've seen very aggressive Chinese actions in cyber warfare to steal IP secrets, patents from American and other tech companies, Europe, Japan, there has been an erosion of support in the business community for China. It's almost disappeared. And then on the other side of the coin, national security people like myself see the militarization of the Paracells and the Spratlys, and see the confrontational attitude towards the Japanese in the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, and see the Chinese military strategy competing to push the American carrier battle groups out beyond the first island chain, and the intense competition in the tech wars that we talked about, in quantum computing, in biotech, in AI. American attitudes have really changed, and it's happened quite rapidly. There's a conversion of both political parties. Most editorial writers, most national security people now very worried that we're in a competitive phase with China. I've been very struck by it. I share most of these concerns that China has exceeded what should be normal in a relationship in the cyber aggression that China has waged against our country, which exceeds in many ways the cyber aggression of Russia. And that's how the Trump administration talks about it, that China is actually a much stronger threat than the Russian government. So we need to cope with that in the relationship. And I would hope that there be some reflections in Beijing on the excessive aggression versus our tech companies. I know this is shared in Japan and South Korea and in many parts of Europe, but I can only speak for my, how I analyze my own country in saying this.
Jonathan?
Jonathan Paris, a member of the IISS. Mr. Burns.
Mr. Burns. Nick, we've known each other for about 30 years.
30, but
31.
We used to see each other at his favorite place, the Ditchling.
Yeah.
So your first question is, you've stayed at Harvard a lot longer than I would have guessed you would. So what have you learned being in the academic environment that was different from being in the state?
Not a bad place to be.
But that's the first question. But the second question is about 2020, 2024. Seems to me, I'll just throw it out and you can comment, that what I take away is that in 2024 we're going to have a Democratic president. Maybe a Beto O'Rourke or somebody, as you say, a centrist. But in 2020, Trumpism still strong. The fact that you've had two-term, previous presidents were 2 terms, previous 3 presidents were 2 terms, right? Clinton, Bush, and Obama.
Yeah.
I would say, assuming this guy could stop eating McDonald's and slim down and look like you, he's a shoo-in for 2020, and it's just a matter of whether he hangs in there or whether Mike Pence succeeds him. So I think that the analysis should be Mike Pence following him or Trump himself for a second term. What does that mean?
Well, here I don't have expertise in the American political system. I just have opinions. So that
we're all talking opinions.
For whatever it's worth. I would contest this, Jonathan. I would say that if you look at all the indicators of political party participation, where the demographics of the United States going with an increasing Latino population, with increasing voter registration in African American parts of the United States, of our big cities, it's going to be extremely difficult for any Republican to win in 2020. Not impossible. A lot of it will depend on the state of the economy. I hope we don't go into recession. I sincerely hope we don't in 2019 or 2020, but a lot of economists think we might. We in the West. Perhaps even a global recession. That'll hurt the incumbent party. It always does. Although the president could, and we were talking, the president now has an identifiable foe. Democratic control of the House. He might be able to pin it on the Democrats.
Pelosi.
Number one. Number two, will there be one opponent or 2 of Donald Trump? We've seen consistently the 2000 election and the 2016 election, third-party candidates torpedo Democrats. Hillary Clinton would be president today were it not for Jill Stein. And yes, look at the vote counts and likely voters. And Al Gore would have won had it not been for Ralph Nader in 2000. And so is it going to be one person running against Trump or 2? And two would be advantageous for Trump. Third, is there going to be a constitutional crisis? Is Trump going to usurp the authority of the president and try to block a Justice Department investigation into his party and his family? And if he blocks it, I'm not sure which way that issue would cut. He is a brilliant politician. People have underestimated him. I underestimated him. One of the reasons why they won the Senate on Tuesday is because he held these rallies. He defended Republican candidates. He's very persuasive. People believe in him. He's at about 38 to 40% support. He can't seem to get beyond that, which makes you think he's very vulnerable in 2020. But he has fervency among his supporters. So I don't think it's inevitable he wins if he runs, if he's able to run. Given the legal troubles he might be in, who knows? I don't know, but that's a possibility. But if the Democrats nominate someone from the center who can speak to a wide swath of Americans, who has experience, and there are a lot of people in the party who I think meet this definition, I think given demographics and the energy among millennials and women, you'd have to give the advantage right now to that mythical, unknown Democrat. We're 2 years away. A lot can happen between now and then, but I think the Democrats have a real shot at taking the White House.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, my name is Dawood Azami. I work for the media. You said earlier that every ally in NATO supported America after 9/11.
That's right.
I mean, you remember not only allies, not non-allies, even competitors supported America, Russia, Iran, China, and many other countries in the region.
Not Iran, but Russia certainly did.
Well, Iran was a Bonn conference.
It was.
They were supportive of the whole strategy.
Yeah.
But that's changing now. It's becoming another competition. And countries in the region are making contacts with the Taliban. Russians, Iranians, Chinese are all talking to the Taliban now. It was only Pakistan in the past. And there's another view in the region that it's not only about war on terror. It's not only about counterterrorism. The mission has a strategic element too. But the question is that it's becoming more complicated, and the resolution of the conflict will be much more difficult. So how do you see the end game now?
Oh, I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to put together a diplomatic process that can work for the Afghan government of Ashraf Ghani. And I have tremendous personal respect for him. I know him well. And we can't forsake him. But at the same time, there has to be some kind of endpoint for the NATO military involvement, given the sacrifices we've made, given the expense, and given the fact that we have bigger challenges elsewhere. We have to contain Putin in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And we're doing that, but that takes a major effort. Europe and the United States and Canada have to think about our strategy towards China. We have to be together on that strategy. And of course, we're, the French, the Germans, the British, the Americans in places like Mali and Niger and Somalia are contending, trying to help African governments cope with indigenous terrorist movements, Nigeria. And so you have to focus. And I think, nearing the 18-year mark, we have to have an honest attempt for diplomacy. The U.S. has held back. We have not wanted, during the George W. Bush and most of the Obama years, engage the Taliban. There's no reason we should like them, but that's what not diplomacy is all about. Diplomacy is about interest. And so I do think we're right to see, is there a possibility of a ceasefire that would be an advantage to the Afghan government? Is there a possibility of a political settlement that would stabilize and strengthen the Afghan government? Those are high bars, but that should be what we should investigate. And so for the European countries and America to be part of that process, and the neighboring states, India, Pakistan, part of the process, I think that's essential. But only, I hope, with the support of Ashraf Ghani, so that this helps him and strengthens him, because clearly right now the Taliban have the tactical advantage outside the major cities of Afghanistan. So we're looking at a major change, but I think a welcome change on an exploratory basis.
And the strategic advantages, I mean, this is what Russians and Iranians view the U.S. presence in Afghanistan.
It
can be used to counter China in a way. because of the CPEC and BRI and everything else. I mean, this is what they believe in.
Thank you for raising this. I'd say very quickly, the only way we can be successful in support of President Ghani is to have China and Russia involved. And in a way, Iran's going to have to be involved. They're a neighbor. And China is a major force in Pakistan. China's a major investor in Afghanistan. Russia has historic interests. And so as we sanction Russia over Skripal, and we contain them in the Baltic states, you do have to work with the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians in places like Afghanistan. I worry the Trump administration has ended all contact with the Iranian government, not to our advantage, not to be investigating places where we can work together productively. That's what it'll take.
I recall when we were considering NATO taking over in Afghanistan, I consulted all of the governments in the region, but the American ambassador to NATO prevented me from speaking to Iran at that point. I can't remember who that was.
I think I was under instruction from Washington. But what did we learn from that experience?
Yeah, we did.
That Yitzhak Rabin said it really well when he justified shaking Arafat's hand, September 1993. He said, "You don't make peace with your friends." His words, "You make peace with very unsavory enemies." And so we have to work with the Russians and Iranians in places where they have leverage that could be to our advantage, right? Yeah. I think that's what we Americans have learned that, George.
I know. There's an old political expression which is, "Don't turn your opponents into enemies." You know,
right.
A lot of people never learn that. I've got to come to Desmond, and I'll come back to you, Jonathan, if you want. Desmond?
I'd just like to come back to your point about Trump and Trumpism being an aberration. I just wonder whether this is a kind of view that's, will play well in London and in Cambridge, and as you say in Berkeley, there's a hope with fingers crossed that that will indeed be the case. Right. And yet, I wonder about that, and I'm kind of. I recall the Trump speech, one of the Trump speeches in the UN, which, in this sort of heart of multilateralism, castigated multilateralism and talked about the doctrine of patriotism, which was an interesting doctrine. But I just sort of wonder whether the sort of the flux, the tide has turned. There will be diminishing interest. And particularly after 8 years and not just 4. And NATO is under threat, and the WTO likewise, and there's a whole range of international organisations. And in thinking about the global order, the global order has changed. In all sorts of ways, economically, in terms of China and Chinese influence. And I suppose I just sort of wonder whether this is a false hope, or whether actually the global order has changed radically, and multilateralism will be very different, after Trump, as a result of Trump.
So, Desmond, thank you. I think this is the key question. And I'm confirmed that he is an aberration, but I understand the doubts. Looking at 2016 and looking at this week, I understand the doubts. This gets back to House divided. There's no question that Trump has a very strong core support in the United States. Maybe it's 35% of the electorate. Maybe it's 40 in its best days. But it's not higher than that. And just looking at the polls and the results of the last 2 elections, 16 and 18, this week, there's no question that the majority of Americans are not with him. The only question politically is, will those people vote? That's what the midterms were all about. We did have historically high turnouts. Now, relative to Europe, you won't be impressed by our high turnouts of 48, 49%, but for us, quite significant. And it's all about, this, but it's all about mobilizing your voters. House divided doesn't mean 50-50. A House divided means, 60-40. Or perhaps even more in favor of the Democrats. If you look across all demographics and look at all the polls, the Democrats have the numerical advantage. The Republicans have the solidarity. And so the task for the Democrats, both locally, state, federal, is to encourage people, lead people, to express themselves. And you saw that among women on Tuesday. It was a very powerful Democratic wave. Okay, it wasn't a big blue tidal wave. It wasn't a tsunami. It was a strong wave. If you remember the data points I read out at the very end about what happened. two other things. Americans do not want to act unilaterally. I know that's the perception of us. It was when George and I were working together, Iraq, Rumsfeld, Abu Ghraib, old Europe, new Europe, we all remember this. Look at the polls. Americans they value allies. They value multilateral trade. Just look at the numbers. And so we need leaders who can talk about that, carry people along with that. And the other thing that's going to weaken the president is, and I'm going to be very blunt here, and I can't believe I'm saying this about an American president, his character, his base character, the lies, the repeated lies. A lot of people have turned away from him based on his character. And I think that's going to prevent him, I would predict, from being reelected in 2020.
The young woman in the middle up there. This needs to be the last question, I feel. Time is up.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. I am going to do my work at the Institute and do some work on European defense.
Yeah.
So if I may, I want to go back to your comment about strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more. So I understand that PESCO is on its early days.
Yeah.
And to develop capabilities, a lot of time is required. But you mentioned that there is no capacity, so we should instead aim for strategic responsibility. So could you elaborate a bit more on the reasons why there is no capacity? Does it have to do with political will, money, or something else?
Thank you very much. And I'm going to, after my brief response, I think Lord Robertson is the authority on this issue, and he is a European and a Brit, and therefore he has a better sense of it. We fought together a battle 2003, 4, and 5 over attempts by Gerhard Schroeder and Jacques Chirac, essentially to set up strategic autonomy. Separate European headquarters, remember the Tervuren debate, 2003 and 4. And we saw that as entirely duplicative of what we already had in NATO. This is at a time of a transatlantic divide over the Iraq War. A very ugly period that we had to deal with. We're in a different place now. Mike Pompeo and Jim Mattis respect their European colleagues. And I think what the Americans and Canadians want is to see greater military capacity within Europe. If that can come from PESCO, all the more power. If it can come through strategic responsibility, all the more power. But for Emmanuel Macron, and I have a lot of respect for him and what he's done, for him to say 3 days ago that there ought to be strategic autonomy, and the UK and France, as well as the European Union, should build an independent military because of China, Russia, and the United States, that's misplaced. That's going too far. Because for all Trump's rhetoric, the United States has actually, under Trump and Obama, increased its military presence in Eastern Europe, rebuilt the armored capacity of the United States that had hollowed out in Europe through the Afghan and Iraq wars. We're fundamentally dedicated to contain Russia. We have American troops in Poland. The Poles are talking about Fort Trump. I don't think we should name it Fort Trump. It should not be a non-NATO facility. We're doing all the right things in NATO. And I think the French president is entirely off base here. And at least in American English, but I'll leave it for the mother tongue disciples to say this, autonomy means without you. Responsibility means with you. It's just the wrong word. For American ears. I don't know if the Brits feel the same way.
Throw in Marshall Patent.
Pardon? Well, yeah, that's another issue.
Yeah, well, I was asked on the radio this morning about the European army, but I think we've heard this before.
Yeah.
The concept of a single European army is not the same as a single European currency. You can have an aspiration to have closer and closer collaboration, especially in the era of Donald Trump, when you don't know whether or not there's going to be America there to deal with any specific regional problem that might come up. At least with Obama, it was leading from behind, but I think there's a genuine concern that there won't be any leading at all, and there might actually be a blockage. Because the precedent has been established that you can have a formation under a NATO flag that doesn't involve all of the NATO allies. But as you have already said, as we know, any power in NATO has a veto. Yeah. So the NATO flag can only fly if everybody is actually in favour of that. So I think there is a problem at the moment with political will in Europe, but there's also a problem with worrying about whether America would be there and whether America might actually, in a situation, choose to veto. And that's why I think there will be a drive for more autonomy, but I don't believe that that will threaten NATO, because I think the more they create in PESCO and with the rest of it, the more that will be available for any NATO operation that is there. But I think keeping the alliance together, keeping the allies together with a single purpose and with a single sort of concentration on the values, then the better it will be. I don't think this debate, which is really a debate of rhetoric and words, whether it's autonomy or responsibility, in effect what matters is capabilities. And if people read our report, which is on the King's College website today, they will see that we're talking here about much more cooperation in intelligence, in cyber, but also in the industrial sphere, where a lot of European money is spent in competitive systems.
Yeah.
If there's much more cooperation on that basis, you'll get more bang for your euros. Doesn't rhyme, but that's what it's about. Anyway, at this point, I've been told to be brief and to be punctual. So I thank you, Nick, very much for explaining this after. Thank you. Very good.